My name is April, and I'm the daughter of settler and immigrant parents. I'm not Indigenous, and I'm here in Treaty 6 to tell you about an international experience that illustrated for me my responsibility to Indigenous issues. As part of our MA in Global Leadership, my Royal Roads cohort visited communities throughout the Amazon and the Andes of Ecuador. I thought I had a basic understanding of Indigeneity going into my trip because I had worked in and with Indigenous communities for over 10 years. But I wasn't understanding the full scope, the global context, until I saw the Indigenous experience on another continent. When we arrived, I first noticed how different these cultures were from each other and from Indigenous cultures at home. But as the trip wore on, I started to notice that what was the same was how Western worldviews are impacting Indigenous people on both continents in similar ways. For example, I met Juan in the Amazon, who's building a syllabic system to liberate Indigenous languages from the Latin alphabet. And I was so excited to introduce him to my friends back home who teach Cree or Nahiawan syllabics. And the relevance of those connections was astounding. Here are people across continents with very different cultures, but fighting the same exact battle to preserve their languages. Next, in Zawada, a community displaced by Canadian mining operations, and then again in the Andes, we saw the impact of resource extraction. One community actually gathered on the road to bar our bus from entering their community because we were Canadian and they thought we were there to take something from them. Here we were, 12 Canadians used to being welcomed the world over, now a feared enemy in the same dispute over land rights that's happening in Canada with unceded nations like the Wet'suwet'en. For the duration of our time in Ecuador, the country was this political pressure cooker. Indigenous issues were fueling massive public demonstrations, and a small group of us extended our trip after our studies, but overnight, the nation erupted into this chaos. We received a message from our embassy to return home if we could, and our group has a mix of departure stories from sleeping on the airport floor with hundreds of other people to driving through a city of road blockades and burning tire fires. But here's one thing that enlightened me to my own bias. Ecuador declared a state of emergency and called in the military. And as someone who's dabbled in activism, I knew this as a bad thing. A state of emergency supersedes human rights, so the military can uphold the will of the government at all costs. And I thought everyone believed this, until I heard a classmate on the bus say that they were so relieved that we would be safe at the hotel now that the military was coming. Wow, totally different perspective. At the time, in my head, I was like, are you serious? Here comes the tear gas and the rubber bullets, and we don't even know how they handle public demonstrators here. But being placed in this experience with a diverse collection of people, I realized that my thinking was only mine. Multiple truths existed in that moment, in that vehicle. And I think that that exposure to alternate worldviews is the fundamental value of international education. Unfortunately, in this case, the tear gas and the rubber bullets did come. But the news I got from English media in Canada didn't show me that. Stories were interpreted through a Western lens and reporting was minimal. I was being brought into the crisis, though, through messages from people on the ground, and I had to filter their perspectives through my limited understanding of the local condition, my bias, and my perceptions of appropriate policing. People that I met in Ecuador were sending me videos of demonstrators being beaten by police, asking me to do something to help them to get the truth out about what was happening in Ecuador. I didn't even know what to believe. So I started finding local news from Ecuador and using Google to translate it from Spanish to English. And only then did I start finding stories that spoke truth to the videos blowing up my phone. In the end, what I observed was a nation of people who reminded the government who they work for. And that might sound radical, but here we have a critical mass of people who don't like a bill their government just signed. So they flood the streets peacefully, led by Indigenous leaders. They shut their cities down completely just by taking up space with their bodies and their voices. They stay through 12 days of tear gas, police, and military pressure. And in the end, the government conceded to the will of the people. International reps came in to moderate talks, and Indigenous leaders were given a promise that they could negotiate a rewrite on the bill they had just overthrown. I sat back and thought, Holy smokes, they did it. And then I thought, why can't we? We hire our government and they're governing with our resources, financial and otherwise. So why shouldn't we be able to remind them they work for us? Indigenous communities at home have had standoffs and demonstrations for preservation of language, land, life, clean water, and I participated sometimes, but I was never a great activist. People at protests often shout, "The people, united, will never be defeated." I couldn't even say it because I never believed it. No protest that I'd walked in or letter to my MLA ever seemed to accomplish anything. This trip triggered me to examine why that is. And I think my key realization is that these weren't activists in the streets of Quito. They were families, communities. They were mothers, grandmothers, fathers, farmers, weavers, artisans. They were just people with a collective voice and faith in their power to peacefully stand together. So my question for everyone now is, when you believe in something, do you show up for it? And if not, why? You might have a legitimate reason that works for you, and I also want to respect that not everyone in Ecuador agreed with the mass public protests. There were, of course, competing priorities and perspectives on the ground. Some of my classmates surely came out of this same exact experience with extremely different ideals than me. But this is how my learning impacted me. It was a year ago, October 2019, when I gained this more globalized perspective on the plight of Indigenous peoples, that these problems aren't issues that impact some of my neighbors or a community up north. These are global flaws in our systems and the way we think about land ownership and what or who is expendable in the name of profit. What good is an ally to a global problem? I can't be an ally traveling alongside my Indigenous friends, cheerleading while they fight their battles. I have to show up for these causes because I can't stand the injustice, because it hurts me to know that businesses representing my country are displacing people for profit all over the planet. What would happen if we all showed up for the things we believe in? And if we had the courage to stay for 12 days, or as long as it took?